Chapter 1. The Sunday Service in Marleycombe. Village of Marleycombe lay tucked away like a pressed flower between rolling hills and patchwork fields. Its stone cottages clustered around a green, so neatly clipped it looked trimmed by angels. There was a post office, a bakery with respectable scones, a fishmonger who delivered on Thursdays, and of course St. Mildred's Church, where most villagers congregated on Sundays, partly for religion, mostly for routine. It was the second Sunday in April, and the sky was undecided, caught between spring warmth and the bitter remnants of March. Inside St. Mildred's, a few of the congregation were already removing their gloves and settling into the pews, nodding politely to one another with the mild reserve peculiar to English village life. Reverend Simmons had just adjusted his stole when the bell above the church gave its first of 9 solemn tolls. Miss Marple sat in the second row on the left, dressed in a sensible gray coat and a hat that had seen better seasons, but was freshly brushed. She always arrived early, not out of piety, but because she liked to observe the arrivals. People revealed quite a lot in how they entered a place, she often said. That morning, she'd already noted that Edith Hornby had come alone for the second week running, that young Clive Wetherall had a curious bruise on his jaw, and that Mrs. Denham's eyes were unusually red by the 9th chime. The doors creaked open once more, and everyone turned, not subtly, to see who would dare arrive at the last minute. It was Mr. Pargeter, the village solicitor, looking slightly flushed. He mouthed an apology to the Reverend, and took a place beside the widowed Mrs. Henshaw, who slid a hymnal toward him with a look of faint disapproval. Reverend Simmons cleared his throat and began the service. It passed as most Sundays did: readings, hymns, a sermon gently urging forgiveness, and the long-awaited blessing of tea afterwards in the vicarage garden. Miss Marple, who rarely missed the opportunity for tea, where cakes and conversation flowed more freely than any parish council meeting, walked over at her usual pace, nodding to those she passed. The vicarage garden was a quaint affair, with lopsided rose bushes and daffodils leaning like trunks toward the sun. The tablecloths were white, though slightly windblown, and the cakes were homemade. Miss Marple took a thin slice of gingerbread and settled herself next to Miss Felicity Lark, who was fussing with the teacups. "Did you see Mr. Pargeter's arrival?" Miss Lark asked in a whisper, pouring tea that trembled slightly in her cup. "I did," Miss Marple replied mildly. "And I thought it odd he didn't speak with young Tommy Jessup. He usually shares a word or two with him, doesn't he?" Felicity nodded, surprised. "Now that you say so, yes. And Tommy left before the final." He rushed off, didn't he?" "He did indeed." They sipped quietly, their eyes scanning the crowd. It was a comfort and a curiosity to Miss Marple how much could be known without a single word being exchanged. Then came the scream. It was high-pitched, female, and unmistakably real. Every head turned toward the lane beside the churchyard, where a young woman in a blue cardigan stood pale and trembling, pointing toward the small red letterbox embedded in the stone wall at the far end of the path. Marple set down her tea with practiced calm and began to walk, her cane tapping softly on the flagstones. A few villagers had already rushed forward, forming a hesitant semicircle around the letterbox. Young Clive Wetherall was peering inside, with a furrowed brow. "It's a hand," someone whispered. "There's a hand sticking out." "Good heavens," murmured Reverend Simmons. Miss Marple arrived last, not pushing her way forward, but standing a little to the side, where the expressions of the crowd were visible and unguarded. The hand was indeed there, pale, unmoving, and unmistakably real, protruding from the open slit of the old letterbox, as though someone had desperately reached out before being trapped. No one spoke for a moment. Then Mr. Pargeter stepped forward, his voice suddenly grave. "We must alert the authorities." As the crowd began to stir with panic and speculation, Miss Marple turned her gaze to the group. There were already tears in Mrs. Denham's eyes. Young Tommy Jessup was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Pargeter looked pale beneath his usual ruddy complexion, and Edith Hornby had gone faint. The forgotten letterbox, used so rarely, it was practically a relic, had, on this quiet Sunday, become the center of something grim. And in that strange hanging silence, as the first constable was summoned from the station on Brook Street, Miss Marple simply adjusted her gloves and looked quietly thoughtful. It was not the first time the village had seemed picture-perfect on the surface, while something darker crept beneath, and it would not be the last. Chapter 2. Whispers on the Green by Monday morning. The village of Marleycombe was already deep in the throes of speculation. Word had traveled with the unnatural speed peculiar to small communities, where people spoke in hushed tones yet rarely stopped talking, though the police had swiftly cordoned off the lane and covered the letterbox with a canvas sheet. The image of that pale, lifeless hand had lodged itself firmly in the minds of the townsfolk. The murder, because everyone was calling it, that had upset the comforting regularity of their lives. Like a drop of ink in a glass of milk. At the heart of the village green, the Copper Kettle Cafe was buzzing. Cups clinked, spoons stirred, tea endlessly, and voices dropped whenever someone entered. Miss Marple, dressed as neatly as ever, and accompanied by her light knitting bag, entered without fuss. She didn't need to ask for her usual seat. Mrs. Moffat, the cafe owner, always kept the little table by the front window for her. Terrible business, isn't it? Mrs. Moffat said, leaning in conspiratorially as she poured Miss Marple a fresh cup. Poor Mr. Jessup says he found her when he came to post a birthday card. His sister said he nearly fainted. Miss Marple nodded politely. So young Tommy was the one who found her? Mrs. Moffat blinked. Oh, didn't you hear? They say he ran all the way to the vicarage, white as a ghost. It was Miss Alcott who heard him first, then the Reverend ran out to look. I shouldn't say it, but between you and me, she dropped her voice even further, Tommy's not been quite right lately. Talks to himself. His mother says he's artistic, but I say there's a difference between creative and peculiar. Miss Marple, whose knitting needles had just begun their quiet clicking, simply smiled. Tommy has always struck me as sensitive rather than strange, Mrs. Moffat sniffed. Sensitive people often see what others miss. Which, of course, was precisely Miss Marple's belief as well. She spent the next hour observing, as she often did, though she appeared merely to be lost in a pattern of pearl stitches and thoughtful sips of tea. Conversations floated around her. Some believed the hand belonged to a stranger. Others insisted it was local. There were mutterings about Mr. Pargeter's hasty arrival at church, and about Mrs. Denham fainting near the hedgerow. Suspicion bounced like a tennis ball between townsfolk, everyone with their own theory, all based on the little they thought they knew. Miss Marple's attention sharpened when she heard a particular name, Lillian Cope. It was the first time she'd heard the name mentioned in years. Her, sighed Mrs. Duckett, the baker's wife, in a high-pitched whisper. She left years ago, didn't she? After that. Unpleasantness. What unpleasantness? Asked young Molly Lark, wide-eyed. Mrs. Duckett lowered her voice. She had a child. Dear, out of wedlock. It was all very hush-hush. Her father sent her to an aunt in Wales, but someone told me she came back last month, quietly, stayed at the old Cope place. She didn't want to be seen, apparently. But why would she be near the letterbox? That's just it. Someone said they saw her, on Saturday, around dusk, talking to someone in the lane. Miss Marple said nothing, but her fingers paused for a moment on the yarn. She remembered Lillian bright-eyed, beautiful, a little reckless. She had disappeared one summer with barely a word, and left behind a trail of speculation that had faded only with time. Now, to hear her name again in the context of a possible murder, Miss Marple felt the old, Unmistakable chill of intuition. She folded her knitting quietly and stood. "Going already, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Moffat. "Yes," she replied with a faint smile. "I think I shall take a walk by the old Cope house. The daffodils come up early there." Which was true, but only partly. The real reason was far more subtle. Something didn't sit right. A forgotten letterbox. A hand reaching out. A girl who'd been forgotten by the village, and had perhaps returned with her own secrets. As she stepped out into the chill spring air, Miss Marple reflected, not for the first time, that Marleycombe, like all villages, wore two faces. One for company, and one for truth, and she had always been rather good at telling them apart. Chapter 3. The Return of Lillian Cope. Miss Marple's footsteps were slow but deliberate as she made her way past the green, then along the narrow lane that led toward the old Cope residence. It was a modest 2-story cottage made of weathered gray stone, half swallowed by ivy and with curtains drawn tightly shut even at midday. Once it had been a cheerful little home, painted blue with climbing roses out front. But time and scandal had let it fall into neglect. She paused before the gate, now rusted at the hinges, and allowed herself a moment of quiet observation. No movement behind the windows. No sound except the distant song of a robin and the faint rustle of wind through budding hedgerows. But the garden bore recent signs of care. The grass had been cut, not expertly but recently, and a pile of old flower pots lay beside the porch, as if someone had intended to start a new. So it was. True, then. Lillian Cope had returned. Miss Marple let herself walk past the house slowly, not pausing too long lest it seem impolite. She knew how villagers watched windows, and she had no desire to feed the gossip any more than necessary. But in that brief, passing glance, she noticed something interesting. A cracked pane in the front window had been mended with brown parcel tape. Very few people repaired glass so poorly unless they'd returned in haste or intended only to stay briefly. She continued down the lane until it turned and curved past the field that bordered the church, bringing her to the now famous Letterbox. It had been sealed with a wooden board and yellow police tape. 2 constables stood nearby, speaking quietly and smoking. They nodded respectfully to her, but did not interfere. Miss Marple returned the courtesy. She had no wish to intrude. Yet by the time she returned home to her cottage on Church Lane, her thoughts were already aligning like pieces on a chessboard. She brewed a fresh pot of tea, placed 2 digestives on a saucer, and sat by the window where the afternoon light filtered softly through lace curtains. Then came the knock. She knew before answering that it would be someone from the village. She was not wrong. "Miss Marple?" came a hesitant voice. May I come in?" It was Edith Hornby. A nervous woman by nature, Edith had the pinched expression of someone who had held onto a secret for too long. Miss Marple led her in gently, offered her tea, and waited. Edith sat down stiffly, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "I wasn't going to say anything," she began, "but then I thought, if I don't tell someone, I'll simply go mad." "Tell me what, dear?" Miss Marple asked kindly, pouring the tea with practiced calm. "It's about Lillian Cope," Edith whispered. "I saw her. I wasn't meant to, but I did." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "When did this happen?" "Saturday night, about 8 o'clock. I was coming back from my sister's. I'd missed the last bus and had to walk down Mill Lane. That's when I saw Lillian. She was at the letterbox, and she was arguing with someone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed very slightly. "Did you recognize the other person?" Edith hesitated. "I'm not sure. I don't want to say anything unless I'm certain." "Say what you remember." "Just that." Edith looked down. It was a man, tall, with a coat dark gray, I think, and a hat. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I think it was Mr. Pargeter. There it was. Miss Marple didn't gasp, didn't blink, only let her teacup rest gently on its saucer. That's quite a serious thing to suggest, Edith. I know. But he used to call on her, years ago. Before everything happened, people used to whisper. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. I remember. There had indeed been whispers. About Lillian and the much older Mr. Pargeter, who had been married then. About discreet visits, gifts quietly exchanged. And then, abruptly, Lillian had vanished, and Mr. Pargeter's wife had taken ill and died within a year. Some had joined the dots. Most had chosen not to. You must tell the police, Miss Marple said gently. I can't, Edith whispered, panic rising in her voice. What if I'm wrong? What if I only think it was him? He's such a respected man. They'd never. Believe me. But I couldn't not say anything. I had to tell someone. Miss Marple nodded. You did the right thing. Leave the rest to me. Later that evening, as she stood in her small kitchen preparing a supper of boiled eggs and toast, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. Lillian had returned under the cover of dusk. She had met someone at the very letterbox where her hand was later found. A man. Possibly Mr. Pargeter. And if so, it meant something old had resurfaced. A debt. A threat. A memory. Miss Marple understood better than most. The past had long roots, and secrets buried in the soil of a village like Marleycombe rarely stayed buried for long. Tomorrow, she would pay a visit to the Cope house again, but this time, she would knock. Chapter 4. An interview with the dead girl's father. Tuesday. Morning arrived gray and listless, with low clouds hanging over Marleycombe, like the village itself had paused in breath. News had spread quickly that the body discovered at the letterbox had been officially identified. It was indeed Lillian Cope. That name spoken aloud now, no longer whispered, had unleashed a torrent of speculation, fear, and memory among the villagers. For those who remembered her as the laughing girl who used to cycle through the green with ribbons in her hair, the news had a ghostly weight. And for those who had always quietly judged her, it was confirmation of some unspoken, long-harbored prophecy. Girls who left under a cloud rarely returned to sunshine. But Miss Marple was not content with prophecy. She needed facts and faces, which is why she now stood, umbrella in hand, before the gate of Alfred Cope, Lillian's father. The Cope cottage was smaller than the one Lillian had been seen returning to. After her departure years ago, Alfred had sold the family home and moved into a modest stone dwelling at the edge of Lower Marleycombe. Miss Marple had not spoken to him in many years, not out of ill will, but because Alfred had grown quieter with age, more bitter and resistant to what he called parish gossip. She knocked gently. A long pause followed, and then the door opened to reveal a man aged well beyond his years. Alfred Cope had once been ruddy and broad-shouldered, a builder by trade, but now his face was lined with sorrow and strain. His eyes, however, still burned with that quiet, guarded fire Miss Marple remembered. "Miss Marple," he said, voice gruff. "I thought you might come." She gave a soft, respectful smile. "May I sit with you, Mr. Cope? I won't trouble you long." He hesitated, then stepped aside and waved her in. The house smelled of pipe smoke and boiled cabbage. A clock ticked solemnly on the mantel, and a single photograph sat on the shelf. Lillian, about 16, in a summer dress, smiling as though nothing in the world could ever dim that light. "I'm sorry for your loss," Miss Marple said quietly. Alfred sank into his chair and nodded, his hands clasped between his knees. "She was only back a few weeks, came without warning, just turned up." "And you spoke with her?" He gave a mirthless chuckle. "If you can call it that." "She knocked on the door late one evening. Sighed she'd come to make peace. That she'd made mistakes, but she was trying to put things right. Asked if she could stay at the old place. You let her? No, he said bitterly. Told her the old house was empty, not fit to live in, but she said she'd manage. She always thought she could manage. Did she tell you why she had returned? He hesitated. Said she wanted to meet someone. That she had something she needed to say. Wouldn't tell me who. I asked. She looked me in the eye and said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told." You. Miss Marple sat very still. Was it a man, do you think? She asked gently. Alfred's jaw tightened. I think it was him. You mean Mr. Pargeter. He gave her a sharp glance. I never liked that man. Thought himself above the rest of us. And when Lillian left, well, I wondered. A father can guess things. But there was never proof. Never any admission. Just silence from everyone. And now? Alfred shook his head. I don't know. But I know my daughter was frightened. When she came, she didn't say it, but I saw it in her eyes. She said something to me that night. Sighed. You can't erase letters once they're posted, can you, Dad? Then she laughed, but not like she used to. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Letters? That's what she said. I don't know what she meant. She always liked riddles. Do you know if she sent one? Alfred shrugged. Wouldn't be surprised. She was carrying a brown envelope when she left my house that night. Did she mention where she was going? He hesitated. She said she had a message to deliver. I didn't think she meant it literally, but now, that letterbox. He trailed off, and Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his double quotes Mr. Cope. She said, I know you've lost someone you loved very much. But if Lillian tried to make something right before she died, it may help us understand why she died. He nodded slowly, grief etched into every crease of his face. When Miss Marple stepped back out into the chill morning air, her mind was racing down. Lillian had returned with a purpose. She had something to confess or confront. She carried a letter she may never have posted, and she had been afraid. The question now was, what did that letter say? And who would have killed to stop it? Miss Marple did not yet have all the answers, but she knew where to look next. Chapter 5. The secrets of Mr. Pargeter. Miss Marple had always believed that men with secrets often wore their dignity like a coat neatly pressed, immaculately presented, but fraying at the cuffs if one cared to look closely. And Mr. Edwin Pargeter, the village solicitor, was precisely such a man. It was nearly midday when Miss Marple approached Pargeter and Wells. Solicitors, a narrow brick building tucked beside the Marleycombe post office. The brass plaque on the door shone dutifully, and lace curtains framed the small windows. Inside, all was quiet, no bustle of clerks, no sound of conversation, only the low tick of a wall clock and the faint scratch of pen on paper. She was met at the entrance by Miriam, Mr. Pargeter's longtime secretary, a steely woman in her late 50s with tightly pinned hair and the suspicious alertness of someone long accustomed to guarding her employer's privacy. Miss Marple, Miriam, sighed with a smile both pleasant and polite. Mr. Pargeter is rather busy today naturally, with everything going on. I understand, said Miss Marple kindly, but perhaps he might grant me a few minutes. It's about something he'll surely wish to clarify before the police. Form the wrong impression. That, Miss Marple knew, was the right phrase. Miriam blinked, then nodded briskly. One moment. Moments later, she was shown into Mr. Pargeter's office, where the man himself stood behind a desk of dark oak, his back ramrod straight, a silk cravat knotted precisely at his throat. He was a man who wore propriety like armor, but Miss Marple noted that his eyes, always watchful, now held something new, unease. Miss Marple, he said, gesturing stiffly to the armchair across from him. To what do I owe this surprise? She sat delicately, setting her gloves in her lap. I thought it best to speak plainly. Mr. Pargeter, I understand you had contact with Lillian Cope in recent days. His expression did not flicker. Lillian. Cope was a troubled young woman who made poor choices. I had no contact with her, Miss Marple not recently. But you did once, she said gently, when she was younger, before she disappeared. He folded his hands. If you're referring to unkind village gossip, I assure you there was never anything inappropriate. She sought my legal advice once or twice. That was all. She returned to Marleycombe with a letter, Miss Marple continued. She intended to deliver something. Her father believes she may have attempted to post it the night she died. That would explain why her body was found at the letterbox. Pargeter's face twitched ever so slightly. And why, pray, are you telling me this? Because I believe, said Miss Marple softly, that the contents of that letter, if discovered, might upset someone standing. Their reputation. Perhaps their freedom. A silence passed. The solicitor's knuckles whitened slightly where his hands clasped together. Are you accusing me of something? I don't accuse, she said kindly. I observe. I've observed that you arrived late to church on Sunday, something quite unlike you. You appeared agitated, and you didn't speak to young Tommy Jessup, though you usually do. One might wonder where you had been. Just before the discovery. Mr. Pargeter stood suddenly and walked to the window, his back to her. I've built a life on discretion, he said quietly. Service. Duty. My wife is buried not 100 yards from where that poor girl was found. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And yet your life is not as private as you might believe. Edith Hornby saw you Saturday evening. With Lillian. She didn't come forward at first, but she's sure now. He turned slowly. If she saw me, he said hoarsely, she saw me doing what I have every right to do. Speaking to someone from my past. A past I regret. A mistake I tried to correct. Then. Correct it, said Miss Marple. Tell the police. She came to blackmail me, he said abruptly. Not for money, though, she could have. She wanted an apology. Sighed I'd ruined her life, that I'd made her disappear to preserve my name. Miss Marple's face did not change. Did you? He didn't answer for a long time. I begged her to leave it be, to let it die. She wouldn't. She said she'd post a letter to my clients, to my parish, to the press, if need be. Miss Marple's voice was low. Did you harm her, Mr. Pargeter? No, he said flatly. But I did tear up the letter she showed me. She had a copy, she said. Maybe it was in her coat. Or maybe she had already posted it elsewhere. He looked at her with sudden dread. If that letter turns up, it may not, Miss Marple said quietly. But secrets have a way of arriving exactly where they are meant to. She stood. If you're innocent of her death, Mr. Pargeter, you have nothing to fear except your own conscience. And perhaps that is punishment enough. As she left the office, she felt a chill pass through her. Not just because of the confession, but because someone more desperate might have had reason to ensure that letter was never read. And if the letter hadn't been mailed, then perhaps it was still out there, waiting to be found. Chapter 6. The man in the churchyard Wednesday dawned cold, with a thin veil of mist drifting low over Marleycombe. The villagers moved more cautiously now, their conversations clipped and eyes a little less trusting. The murder of Lillian Cope had become more than a tragedy. It had become a mirror in which each resident saw the cracks in their own memories. And relationships. Miss Marple rose early that morning. She had spent the night considering Mr. Pargeter's reluctant confession. That he had once wronged Lillian had cast her aside to protect his position rang sadly true. But there was a difference between guilt of the heart and guilt of the hands. She believed he was hiding something, yes, but not murder. Not that kind of darkness, which meant someone else knew about the letter. Someone else had a far more urgent reason to ensure its silence. She dressed warmly, tucked a folded note into her handbag, and set off for St. Mildred's churchyard. Not for prayer, but for a conversation. The church grounds were empty, save for the tall figure of Constable Rudd, posted by the far gate. He nodded politely to her. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Constable." No word from the inspector. "Yet? Still waiting on forensics, ma'am. They've taken the body to Ipswich for examination. Should have a report by tomorrow." "Very good," she said, before glancing toward the church itself. "Is Reverend Simmons about?" "He's inside. Said he's not talking visitors unless it's urgent." "Bit shaken, he is." "Then I shan't disturb him," said Miss Marple lightly. "But tell him I'll return with a sponge cake for Thursday's supper, if that helps cheer him up." The constable smiled and gave a slight bow, but Miss Marple had no real interest in the vicar that morning. Her real purpose sat across the churchyard, near the oldest graves. Tommy Jessup. The young man was seated on a weathered bench, his knees drawn up, sketchbook on his lap. At 21, Tommy had always been different. Sensitive, quiet, brilliant with watercolors, and forever misunderstood by those who measured value in work boots and pocket watches. Miss Marple approached gently, not wanting to startle him. She noticed he was sketching the old letterbox, half vanished, now beneath the police covering. Even from a few feet away, she saw how he had captured the outline of a hand, elegant, ghostly, reaching outward from the rusted slit. "May I join you?" she asked softly. He looked up and gave her a small, grateful nod. For a moment she said nothing, simply sat beside him and watched the slow turn of mist between the gravestones. "You found her," she said gently. "That must have been terribly frightening." He nodded again. "I didn't know it was real at first. I thought someone was playing a trick. But then I saw the skin. It was cold." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his. "She wasn't a trick. She was a girl with a name. Lillian." Tommy blinked. "I heard them say it in the pub. Lillian Cope. I don't remember her. She left before you were old enough to notice. But she came back, quietly. And she was hurt by something from the past." Tommy looked away. "Everyone hurts people." "Sometimes," said Miss Marple, "but not everyone kills them." He looked back at her sharply then. "You think I did it?" "No, dear. If I thought you did, I'd not be sitting with you. But I think you saw something you're too scared to say." Tommy's fingers clenched around his pencil. His eyes darted to the trees beyond the wall. "I saw someone," he whispered, "before I reached the letterbox. A man, tall. He was wearing gloves, and he dropped something. I thought it was a paper bag, but when I picked it up later, it was a letter, torn in half." Miss Marple's breath caught, but she didn't show it. "Do you still have it?" Tommy nodded and reached into his sketchbook. From between 2 pages, he pulled out a folded, torn envelope. The writing on it was delicate, cursive, but clearly written in haste. It had no stamp, no name, only a single word on the front: confession. "Miss." Marple held the fragment gently, her heart beating faster. She read what remained of the torn message. "You thought I was gone, but I never forgot. You promised me you'd fix it. You said you'd take care of him, but instead you. And now I've come back. I have nothing left to lose. I'll send this to the Gazette if I have to." The rest was shredded. She looked up at Tommy. "Why didn't you show this to the police?" His eyes filled with quiet panic. "Because I thought maybe he would come after me." "Who, Tommy?" He hesitated. I didn't see his face, but I think he smelled of turpentine, like paint thinner, and he walked with a limp. Miss Marple went still. That was new. She tucked the torn letter into her handbag. "Thank you, Tommy. You've been very brave and very helpful. I promise I'll take care of this." As she walked back through the churchyard, her mind was moving like clockwork. A limp. The scent of turpentine. Not Mr. Pargeter. Not Alfred Cope. No. This was someone else entirely. Someone who painted. Someone with something to lose. If Lillian's letter was ever read. Chapter 7. Paint and pretense. Miss Marple returned home with a singular purpose. The torn letter in her handbag and a name already forming at the edge of her memory. A limp. The scent of turpentine. Someone who painted. And then she remembered. Giles Denham, a quiet man, recently moved to Marleycombe with his wife Margaret, an anxious woman who had fainted the day Lillian's body was found. Giles was a hobbyist painter, often seen by the riverbank with his easel and case of oils. He'd held an informal art show in the village hall just last month, all misty watercolors and fogged landscapes. Pleasant enough work, but nothing remarkable, unless you noticed how he avoided portraits. How he never painted people. Miss Marple had noticed. More curiously, Giles Denham walked with a slight but definite limp. He claimed it was from a fall on the stairs years ago. That in itself wasn't suspicious. But the combination of that, the turpentine scent, and Margaret's odd behavior made Miss Marple feel that a visit was now absolutely necessary. She rang the Denham bell at just past 4. Margaret answered, pale and fluttery, her fingers wringing the hem of her cardigan. "Miss Marple," she said, visibly startled. Is something wrong?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said with her most grandmotherly warmth. "I was just walking by and thought I'd check on you. You weren't well on Sunday." Margaret opened the door wider, her hesitation melting slightly under the pressure of politeness. "Oh, well, yes, thank you. I've just been on edge, of course, with everything going on." Miss Marple was led into the drawing room, where the scent of oil paint lingered just beneath the lavender air freshener. Paintings lined the walls, landscapes, rooftops, empty boats on still lakes. A new canvas sat in the corner, covered by a beige cloth. "I do hope I'm not interrupting Giles," Miss Marple said, eyes gently roving. Margaret's shoulders tensed. "He's not in. He's gone to town for supplies." "What a shame," said Miss Marple lightly. "I was hoping to ask him about Lillian Cope. He knew her, I believe?" Margaret froze. I don't think so." "Oh, but surely didn't she come to your home the day before her death?" Margaret's mouth opened, closed, then opened. Again. Well, yes. She stopped by, briefly. "What for?" "She wanted to talk to Giles. Something about painting a portrait." "He said no. A portrait?" Miss Marple said, feigning surprise. "He doesn't usually do portraits, does he?" Margaret shook her head too quickly. "No, never. That's what he told her. He wasn't comfortable." Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "My dear May, I speak frankly with you?" Margaret's eyes filled with sudden tears. He's not a bad man, Miss Marple. He's just made mistakes. We both have. But Lillian was trying to ruin us." "Ruin you?" Miss Marple echoed softly. "What could she possibly say?" Margaret looked down. "Years ago, before we married, Giles had a relationship. It was brief. Foolish. He says he ended it when he learned she was involved with someone else." Miss Marple waited. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "It was Lillian. She came back with a letter. Sighed she wanted Giles to admit it, to say what had happened. She said she'd send copies to my family, to the press, even the local parish newsletter if she had to. He was terrified. And then she died." Margaret looked up, panicked. "He didn't kill her. He couldn't have. He was here with me. Are you sure?" Miss Marple asked, not unkindly. There was a pause. I think so, Margaret said at last. Miss Marple stood, her tone still warm. Thank you, Margaret. I know this has been difficult. If you remember anything else, no matter how small, you must speak up. Margaret nodded, visibly trembling. As Miss Marple stepped into the hallway, her eye fell upon the beige cloth draped over the new canvas. Something about the shape caught her attention. A flat rectangle beneath the cloth, much thinner than a stretched canvas. She paused. May I see Giles's latest work before I go? Margaret blinked. Oh, well, it's not finished, but... She stepped forward and peeled back the cloth. What lay beneath was not a painting. It was a framed document, smudged at the edges, water-damaged and creased, but still legible. The second copy of the letter. Miss Marple read the opening lines silently. You know what you did. If you won't say it, I will. You left me alone, humiliated, and you watched while the others whispered. But now you'll answer for it. I kept everything. Every letter, every sketch, every lie. And at the bottom, though, the signature was blurred. One word stood out: Lillian. Miss Marple turned slowly toward Margaret, whose face had gone white. Then I shan't disturb him, said Miss Marple lightly. But tell him I'll return with the sponge cake for Thursday's supper, if that helps cheer him up. The constable smiled and gave a slight bow, but Miss Marple had no real interest. In the vicar that morning, her real purpose sat across the churchyard. Near the oldest graves, Tommy Jessup. The young man was seated on a weathered bench, his knees drawn up, sketchbook on his lap. At 21, Tommy had always been different. Sensitive, quiet, brilliant with watercolors, and forever misunderstood by those who measured value in work boots and pocket watches. Miss Marple approached gently, not wanting to startle him. She noticed he was sketching the old letterbox, half vanished, now beneath the police covering. Even from a few feet away, she saw how he had captured the outline of a hand, elegant, ghostly, reaching outward from the rusted slit. May I join you? She asked softly. He looked up and gave her a small, grateful nod. For a moment, she said nothing, simply sat beside him and watched the slow turn of mist between the gravestones. You found her, she said gently. That must have been terribly frightening. He nodded again. I didn't know it was real at first. I thought someone was playing a trick. But then I saw the skin. It was cold. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his. She wasn't a trick. She was a girl with a name. Lillian. Tommy blinked. I heard them say it in the pub. Lillian Cope. I don't remember her. She left before you were old enough to notice. But she came back, quietly. And she was hurt by something. From the past, Tommy looked away. Everyone hurts people. Sometimes, said Miss Marple, but not everyone kills them. He looked back at her sharply then. You think I did it? No, dear. If I thought you did, I'd not be sitting with you. But I think you saw something you're too scared to say. Tommy's fingers clenched around his pencil. His eyes darted to the trees beyond the wall. I saw someone, he whispered, before I reached the letterbox. A man, tall. He was wearing gloves, and he dropped something. I thought it was a paper bag, but when I picked it up later, it was a letter, torn in half. Miss Marple's breath caught, but she didn't show it. Do you still have it? Tommy nodded and reached into his sketchbook. From between 2 pages, he pulled out a folded, torn envelope. The writing on it was delicate, cursive, but clearly written in haste. It had no stamp, no name, only a single word on the front, confession. Miss Marple held the fragment gently, her heart beating faster. She read what remained of the torn message. You thought I was gone, but I never forgot. You promised me you'd fix it. You said you'd take care of him, but instead you... And now I've come back. I have nothing left to lose. I'll send this to the Gazette if I have to. The rest was shredded dot. She looked up at Tommy. Why didn't you show this to the police? His eyes filled with quiet panic. Because I thought maybe he would come after me. Who, Tommy? He hesitated. I didn't see his face, but I think he smelled of turpentine, like paint thinner, and he walked with a limp. Miss Marple went still. That was new. She tucked the torn letter into her handbag. Thank you, Tommy. You've been very brave and very helpful. I promise I'll take care of this. As she walked back through the churchyard, her mind was moving like clockwork. A limp. The scent of turpentine. Not Mr. Pargeter. Not Alfred Cope. No. This was someone else entirely. Someone who painted. Someone with something to lose. If Lillian's letter was ever read. Chapter 7. Paint and Pretense Miss Marple returned home with a singular purpose. The torn letter in her handbag and a name. Already forming at the edge of her memory. A limp. The scent of turpentine. Someone who painted. And then she remembered. Giles Denham. A quiet man. Recently moved to Marleycombe with his wife Margaret, an anxious woman who had fainted the day Lillian's body was found. Giles was a hobbyist painter, often seen by the riverbank with his easel and case of oils. He'd held an informal art show in the village hall just last month, all misty watercolors and fogged landscapes. Pleasant enough work, but nothing remarkable, unless you noticed how he avoided portraits. How he never painted people. Miss Marple had noticed. More curiously, Giles Denham walked with a slight but definite limp. He claimed it was from a fall on the stairs years ago. That in itself wasn't suspicious. But the combination of that, the turpentine scent, and Margaret's odd behavior made Miss Marple feel that a visit was now absolutely necessary. She rang the Denham bell at just past 4. Margaret answered, pale and fluttery, her fingers wringing the hem of her cardigan. Miss Marple, she said, visibly startled. Is something wrong? No, my dear, Miss Marple said with her most grandmotherly warmth. I was just walking by and thought I'd check on you. You weren't well on Sunday. Margaret opened the door wider, her hesitation melting slightly under the pressure of politeness. Oh, well, yes, thank you. I've just been on edge, of course, with everything going on. Miss Marple was led into the drawing room, where the scent of oil paint lingered just beneath the lavender air freshener. Paintings lined the walls, landscapes, rooftops, empty boats on still lakes. A new canvas sat in the corner, covered by a beige cloth. I do hope I'm not interrupting Giles, Miss Marple said, eyes gently roving. Margaret's shoulders tensed. He's not in. He's gone to town for supplies. What a shame, said Miss Marple lightly. I was hoping to ask him about Lillian Cope. He knew her, I believe? Margaret froze. I don't think so. Oh, but surely didn't she come to your home the day before her death? Margaret's mouth opened, closed, and opened. Again. Well, yes. She stopped by, briefly. What for? She wanted to talk to Giles. Something about painting a portrait. He said no. A portrait? Miss Marple said, feigning surprise. He doesn't usually do portraits, does he? Margaret shook her head too quickly. No, never. That's what he told her. He wasn't comfortable. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. My dear May, I speak frankly with you? Margaret's eyes filled with sudden tears. He's not a bad man, Miss Marple. He's just made mistakes. We both have. But Lillian was trying to ruin us. Ruin you? Miss Marple echoed softly. What could she possibly say? Margaret looked down. Years ago, before we married, Giles had a relationship. It was brief, foolish. He says he ended it when he learned she was involved with someone else. Miss Marple waited. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. It was Lillian. She came back with a letter. Sighed she wanted Giles to admit it, to say what had happened. She said she'd send copies to my family, to the press, even the local parish newsletter if she had to. He was terrified. And then she died. Margaret looked up, panicked. He didn't kill her. He couldn't have. He was here with me. Are you sure? Miss Marple asked, not unkindly. There was a pause. I think so, Margaret said at last. Miss Marple stood, her tone still warm. Thank you, Margaret. I know this has been difficult. If you remember anything else, no matter how small, you must speak up. Margaret nodded, visibly trembling. As Miss Marple stepped into the hallway, her eye fell upon the beige cloth draped over the new canvas. Something about the shape caught her attention. A flat rectangle beneath the cloth, much thinner than a stretched canvas. She paused. May I see Giles's latest work before I go? Margaret blinked. Oh, well, it's not finished, but... She stepped forward and peeled back the cloth. What lay beneath was not a painting. It was a framed document, smudged at the edges, water-damaged and creased, but still legible. The second copy of the letter. Miss Marple read the opening line silently. You know what you did. If you won't say it, I will. You left me alone, humiliated, and you watched while the others whispered. But now you'll answer for it. I kept everything. Every letter, every sketch, every lie. And at the bottom, though, the signature was blurred. One word stood out: Lillian. Miss Marple turned slowly toward Margaret, whose face had gone white. I told him to burn it, she said weakly. He said no one would ever look here. He said framing it was poetic. Miss Marple's voice was low. If the police had found this, it would be evidence of motive, of a reason to silence her. I didn't know, Margaret whispered. I didn't know what he was going to do. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, because she already knew. Someone had killed Lillian to silence her. And now, the murder weapon wasn't a knife or a blow. It was a letter. A confession. Preserved behind glass. And that was something no killer had planned for. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. Tea with the inspector. By the time Miss Marple arrived back at her cottage on Church Lane, the late afternoon light had turned a soft amber, filtering through the lace curtains and catching dust motes mid-air. She placed the letter, now carefully wrapped in brown parchment, onto her writing desk. Beside her folded knitting and a vase of early bluebells, she did not need to reread the contents. They were seared in her mind. Lillian's words were wounded, resolute, and real. She had returned to Marleycombe not for revenge, but for truth, and now that truth had cost her life. It was time to speak plainly. Not with gossip, not with hints or veiled warnings, but directly with the police, which is why, at precisely 5:30, she walked the 3 streets to the Red Fox Inn, where Inspector Cray had taken up residence in room 3 while investigating the case. It was a curious habit of the inspector to stay near the village rather than in town, but one Miss Marple appreciated. It meant he knew the rhythm of a place, not just the facts. She knocked gently. A gruff "come in" followed, and she opened the door to find Inspector Cray sitting at a small table, coat off, sleeves rolled, a modest spread before him, a sandwich, a pot of tea, and what looked suspiciously like a half-eaten Eccles cake. Miss Marple, he said, sitting up straighter. This is unexpected. I hope I'm not intruding, Inspector. I thought perhaps we might share tea. He blinked, but gestured to the empty chair opposite. By all means. She poured herself a cup, took a delicate sip, and then placed the folded parchment between them. What's this? The missing letter, she said quietly. Or at least the second copy. Cray stared at her for a long moment, then reached for the bundle and opened it slowly. As he read, his brow furrowed. and his jaw visibly tensed. "I thought the girl's father said she only talked about sending letters," he muttered. "She did more than talk," said Miss Marple gently. "She prepared this second version after. The first was destroyed. I found it framed in the denim sitting room tucked beneath a cloth, disguised as an unfinished canvas." "The Denhams?" "Yes, Giles Denham. Lillian threatened to expose him, perhaps not for a crime, but for a personal betrayal. He was terrified she'd tell his wife. She likely did. And Margaret, poor thing, was caught in the middle. But Giles is the one you need to question next." Cray rubbed his chin. "That's motive, all right. But what about the means? Time of death? Alibi?" "She came to the Denham home the night before she was found. Margaret admitted it. Lillian wanted Giles to admit publicly what he'd done. She brought that letter. Margaret said she told him to burn it, but he couldn't resist keeping it. He framed it like a sick trophy." The inspector nodded grimly. "That would explain the lack of forced entry. The alley where the letterbox sits runs just 2 roads down from the Denhams. And Giles Denham fits the description the Jessup boy gave." Miss Marple nodded. "The limp, the smell of turpentine. The time, it all matches. But he's quiet, keeps to himself." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly, "the quiet ones do the loudest harm." The inspector folded the letter again and slipped it into a case file marked Cope, a homicide. "This will help. A lot, but we'll still need the rest of the chain, where she went after the Denhams. Whether he followed her, whether he lured her out. Tommy Jessup saw him near the letterbox. That counts for something. And Edith Hornby saw someone matching his height and Bill arguing with Lillian." Cray sighed. "You do half my job for me, Miss Marple. I only notice things," she said modestly. "People, especially. And people don't change much. Inspector, they only hide better." He smiled at that. "You're not wrong." She sipped the rest of her tea and stood to leave. "One more thing," she added. "If you search the Denham property, I suggest looking beneath the small rowboat at the back of the garden. There's fresh earth there." Cray raised a brow. "You think he buried something?" "I think," said Miss Marple, pulling on her gloves, "he may have buried the original letter." By that evening, Marleycombe was quieter than usual. Inspector, armed with a warrant, had paid a late visit to the Denham house by nightfall. The original letter had been retrieved, damp and mud-stained, but intact. And Giles Denham was taken into custody without incident. His confession came not long after. The confrontation had grown heated. She threatened to tell Margaret the full truth. He had panicked, pushed her. She hit her head. And in a blind, clumsy panic, he had tried to make it look like a symbolic act, leaving her body at the old letterbox. A cruel joke. Or a cover-up. Either way, it had failed. The next morning, Marleycombe woke to a stillness that felt like morning, but also, in some strange way, relief. Lillian's voice had been silenced, but not unheard. Chapter 9. Rumors. And remedies by Thursday morning, Marleycombe had reverted to its usual habits with remarkable speed. The villagers returned to their routines, though now with cautious glances and longer pauses at the notice board. There were fewer idle jokes. At the Copper Kettle, fewer cheerful greetings on Church Lane. Instead, there were questions some whispered, some openly asked. "Did you hear what he did?" Poor Margaret. And they always seemed so normal. "I suppose you never really know people, do you?" Miss Marple, however, had heard this all before. In dozens of villages, over dozens of tragedies. What followed any? Great unmasking was not clarity, it was gossip, dressed as understanding. But beneath it, always, was fear. Fear that someone they trusted had done something terrible, and that perhaps they themselves hadn't seen it. That morning, Miss Marple found herself in Greenleaf Chemist's, not for aspirin or lavender water, but for something much less clinical. Conversation. Mr. Pratt, the pharmacist, was an observant man with a fondness for crosswords and strong tea. He served as Marleycombe's unofficial collector of concerns. If someone had a headache, he knew. If someone had a guilty conscience, he knew that too, if not directly, then by prescription. "Oh, Miss Marple," he greeted cheerfully. "Still keeping us all in line?" "I try my best," she replied, tucking her umbrella neatly under her arm. "You'll be wanting your chamomile?" "Indeed. And perhaps a word or two on the subject of poor Mrs. Denham?" Mr. Pratt's hands paused, mid-reach. "Ah, yes. Well, sad business." "Very." He leaned in slightly. "She's not left the house since the arrest. Her sister came from Devon yesterday. Quiet woman. Took one look at Margaret and told me she hadn't eaten in 3 days." Miss Marple's brows furrowed. "Poor soul. She was frightened long before this happened, and I think she feared Giles more than she ever let on." Pratt nodded. "There were signs. You know, bruises once. She said she fell. But they always say that." Miss Marple accepted the small paper bag of chamomile and thanked him with a quiet nod. Outside, she took the long way home, stopping near the Cope cottage, where she found Alfred Cope tending a pot of soil. His face drawn but focused. She hesitated. At the gate, unsure whether to intrude, he saw her and gave a small nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I was just planting forget-me-nots, Lily's favorite when she was a girl." "They're lovely," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. "A fitting tribute?" He straightened up, wincing slightly from the effort. "I've been thinking about the letter. What she wrote. What she didn't write. Oh? She didn't name him. She didn't demand money. Just truth. She wanted him to say it, to admit it. All she ever wanted was for someone to say, 'I'm sorry.'" His voice cracked. "And maybe I should have said it too." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on his arm. "You're saying it now, and that matters." He looked down at the soil. "I didn't protect her, Miss Marple. Not when she left. Not when she returned. And yet, I keep thinking if I just opened that door wider. Grief always tries to rewrite the past," she said softly. "But it wasn't your silence that killed her. It was someone else's pride." He nodded, eyes glistening. As she turned to leave, he called after her, "Do you think the village will ever forget?" Miss Marple paused. "No, but remembering isn't always a curse. Sometimes it's the start of healing." That afternoon, she returned home and sat quietly with her knitting. The needles clicked softly as thoughts settled around her like dust. Case was solved, but Marleycombe had changed. The forgotten letterbox was no longer just a rusty relic. It had become a symbol of secrets unspoken, of letters unsent, of the quiet things people try to bury until someone brave and broken digs them up again. Lillian Cope had wanted to be heard. And now she was. Chapter 10. The Vicar's Dilemma. The following Sunday, the bells of St. Mildred's Church rang out as usual, their tone unchanged by tragedy, though their echoes seemed to carry something heavier, like the village itself had exhaled and still hadn't caught its breath. Inside, the pews were quieter, the congregation smaller. Several regular faces were missing, most notably Margaret Denham. Those who did attend wore subdued colors, not by fashion, but instinct. Even the hymn singing felt uncertain, as if the voices feared rising too high. In the stillness, from the pulpit, Reverend Simmons did his best to offer comfort, though his own unease clung to every syllable. His homily, typically calm and wandering, today settled on one idea only: forgiveness. It was a sermon Miss Marple listened to very carefully. She had known Reverend Simmons since before he inherited the vicarage from his uncle. He was a kind man, a bit timid, fond of jam-making and Latin epistles, but no fool. And lately, she had noticed the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. Not the lines of age, but of strain. After the service, as the congregation filed out beneath the ancient arch, Miss Marple lingered by the low stone wall of the graveyard. As she'd hoped, Reverend Simmons emerged a few moments later, greeting parishioners with a tired smile. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "you're always the last to leave. A good sign, I hope." "I always find churches more peaceful once the crowd has gone," she replied. They returned to their proper silence. He chuckled politely, but it was thin. She gestured gently toward the benches near the lit gate. "May we sit a moment, Reverend? I wanted to ask you something rather delicate." He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." Once seated, Miss Marple spoke gently. "You've seemed rather burdened of late, and I don't think it's merely the weight of comforting a grieving village." His mouth twitched slightly. "Do I look that transparent?" "Only to those who care to notice." He sighed. "You're right. I have been troubled, and I suspect you already know why." Miss Marple said nothing. He looked toward the church, his voice low. "3 weeks ago, Lillian came to me. She asked for a private confession." "Did she name someone?" "She didn't have to," he said quietly. The pain in her voice was unmistakable. "She told me she had returned to speak the truth that had been kept from her, truth that had altered her life. She asked me whether God forgives those who wait too long to ask for forgiveness." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "And what did you say?" "I told her yes," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "but that sometimes people seek earthly justice before they can accept divine forgiveness." She nodded. She said, "Then I suppose it's time someone heard what really happened to me." He glanced sideways at Miss Marple. She was strong, you know. Sad, but strong. "I asked her if she wanted me to intervene. She said no, that she would handle it herself." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. She nearly did. "Yes," he whispered, "but she was afraid, and she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would give this to the right person." From within his cassock, he pulled out a folded envelope, aged and slightly crumpled. Miss Marple took it with reverent care. It was addressed simply, "To be read only if I am gone." "L.C." She said the other copies might be destroyed, but this one she made me promise to protect. I've been carrying it ever since, and I've been terrified. Miss Marple gave a kind smile. "That's because you're a good man, Reverend. Good people are often the most frightened by evil. It shocks them more." She tucked the envelope into her handbag. "This will help the inquest. It will confirm everything." Simmons nodded. "Then I've done my part." They sat in silence for a long moment as the wind stirred the long grass. Between the graves. At last, Miss Marple stood and offered her hand. "You were her last confessor. You gave her peace." "I hope so," he said quietly. She gave him one last smile. "And now, perhaps, you can find some for yourself." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed the envelope beside her teapot. She would read it once, then hand it to Inspector Cray. There was no thrill in it, no triumph. Only the slow, steady unraveling of lies until the truth, however painful, was left behind. The letterbox had once held secrets. Those secrets were finally being delivered. Chapter 11. The village reacts. By Monday morning, word had spread, though no one could quite say how. Perhaps it was Edith Hornby at the bakery, who'd spotted the constables carrying evidence boxes from the Denham residence. Or perhaps it was the milkman who overheard Reverend Simmons on a hushed call with Inspector Cray. Or maybe it was just Marleycombe's uncanny ability to know things. But by breakfast time, it was as though the entire village had absorbed the news by osmosis. Lillian Cope's letter had been found. Miss Marple, seated at her sunny kitchen window with toast and marmalade, could already see the ripple effect from her front garden. Two elderly ladies paused in front of the parish notice board, whispering behind gloved hands. Down the lane, young Rosie Moffat, usually glued to her bicycle, was instead staring at the postbox with the careful reverence of one who'd heard it. Was once a crime scene dot. It wasn't long before the doorbell rang. "Mrs. Bantry," said Miss Marple warmly, opening the door. "Do come in. I have seed cake." Dolly Bantry entered with the urgency of someone who had waited as long as humanly possible to appear casual. "My dear Jane," she said breathlessly, "the thing's being said at the butcher's." Miss Marple handed her a plate and poured tea. "I expect they're quite dramatic, more than dramatic. They're accusing everyone again, even you, if you can believe it." Miss Marple smiled over her cup. "Oh, I've been accused before, usually just before I'm proven right." Dolly leaned in, eyes gleaming. "They say the letter was full of details, names. Lillian mentioned Giles, but she also hinted at someone else, someone she never named." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. Lillian was careful. She knew the letter could fall into the wrong hands. Dolly chewed thoughtfully. "You think there was someone else involved? Aside from Giles?" "I think Lillian returned for more than one reason," Miss Marple said gently. "Her letter was about betrayal, but betrayal often has layers. One person acts, but others permit it to happen." Dolly's voice dropped to a whisper. "You mean Margaret? Perhaps. Or someone in the village who knew the truth years ago and did nothing." Dolly went quiet, unusually pensive. "It's odd, isn't it?" she said finally. "How something written in private could cause such a storm." "Not odd at all," Miss Marple replied. "Words carry power, especially when they expose what people spend their lives trying to hide." There was a pause, then a gentle knock at the door. It was Edith Hornby, flushed and breathless. "Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt." "Not at all, Edith," Miss Marple said, stepping aside. Edith clasped her bag nervously. "It's just that I remembered something about Lillian from years ago." Miss Marple motioned her to sit. "She came to me one summer, must have been 17. Sighed she needed to post a letter without her father seeing it. Asked if she could use my return address on the envelope." "Did she say what it was about?" "No, only that she was starting over and that it would make someone very sorry one day." I thought she was being dramatic. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on the edge of her teacup. "And did she ever collect the reply?" Edith shook her head. "Not that I remember. But I do recall a very nervous young man coming by a few days later, asking for a Miss L.C. I sent him away. Never saw him again. Can you remember what he looked like?" "Dark hair, cheap suit, nervous hands." Miss Marple exchanged a look with Dolly. There were still threads to unravel, because if someone else had known about Lillian's letter then, and come looking for her, then perhaps this tragedy had deeper roots than anyone had guessed. That evening, as dusk painted the village in muted blue and gray, Miss Marple sat by her fire and reread the lines of Lillian's letter, each word now a puzzle piece. There had been betrayal. There had been silence. And somewhere beneath it all, there was someone still hiding. The village had reacted. Now came the harder part, remembering what it had once chosen to forget. Chapter 12. A visitor from the past. It was just past 10 on Tuesday morning when Miss Marple looked up from her garden to find a stranger standing at her gate. Not just any stranger, he was youngish, no more than 30, with neatly parted black hair and the kind of hesitant expression that suggested he was debating whether to knock or run. He clutched a battered brown satchel close to his chest, and his coat looked too warm for the weather. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted his scuffed shoes, the ink stain on his right cuff, and a twitch in his left eye that bespoke nerves, not a seat. She rose, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened the gate before he could retreat. "Good morning," she said gently. "You look like a man who's come a long way and isn't sure if he's welcome." He looked startled, then relieved. "Ah, yes, that's exactly it. Are you Miss Marple?" "I am." He offered a tentative hand. "My name is Daniel Kirkwood. I believe you knew someone I once did. Lillian Cope." Miss Marple's eyes did not betray the sharp focus now forming behind them. "I knew her, yes. Please, come in." Inside, she served tea and listened as Daniel sat gingerly on the edge of the settee, his satchel still clenched tightly on his lap. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," he began. "I only heard last night." The name Lillian Cope, it caught me off guard. But when I saw the village name mentioned in a news bulletin, I knew it had to be her. "You knew her well?" He nodded. "I met her in Norwich. It must have been 10, maybe 11 years ago. She was working as a cleaner at the paper where I was doing an internship. I was barely out of university. She stood out." "In what way?" Daniel smiled sadly. "She was bright. Not just smart, but vivid. She had this way of looking at you, like she saw through you. And she said things I didn't expect. One day, she found me crying in the stairwell. My editor shredded my first article. She didn't say a word. Just handed me a cup of coffee and said, 'One day you'll write something that matters. Just make sure it's the truth when you do.'" Miss Marple's heart tightened. "That sounded like Lillian. Daniel continued, his voice roughening. "We kept in touch for a while. Then she disappeared. No number, no letters, nothing." "Did she ever tell you where she came from?" Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated. "Once, she mentioned Marleycombe. Said she'd run from something. Someone. I pressed, but she got quiet. Said she was working on something. A letter. Something important." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Do you still have anything from her?" Daniel hesitated, then reached into his satchel. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed and creased. "She sent me this, years ago. Never opened it. I didn't know what it was, thought maybe it was. Goodbye. I didn't open it until last night." He slid it across the table. Miss Marple took it carefully. Inside was a single page, written in Lillian's unmistakable hand. "Dear Daniel, if anything happens to me, you must come to Marleycombe. There's a woman there who sees what others miss. Her name is Miss Marple. Show her this. And please don't let them bury me in silence." Miss Marple sat back, the letter resting in her lap like a living thing. Lillian had known. She had known. She might not make it, and she had chosen her. Daniel cleared his throat. "I came to do what she asked. I don't know what else I can do, but if there's anything left to uncover, I want to help." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "There may be more than you realize, Mr. Kirkwood, and you may be the key." His brows lifted. "Me?" "You knew a side of Lillian the village never saw, and perhaps someone here knew that, feared that." She rose and crossed to her writing desk, opened a drawer, and retrieved a folded slip of paper. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "you and I are going to see someone. A man who once tried to protect himself by silence. We'll see what he says when confronted with our words and yours." Daniel sat straighter, his nervousness replaced with resolve. "You think someone else was involved?" "I know someone else was," Miss Marple said softly. "The question is, how far were they willing to go to keep Lillian quiet?" That night, as rain tapped gently against the window panes, Miss Marple sat alone with the 2 letters, one from Lillian to the police, and one to a man who had once loved her kindness. One had brought justice, the other might bring the truth. Chapter 13. Confrontation at the vicarage. Rain fell steadily the next morning as Miss Marple and Daniel Kirkwood made their way up the gently sloping path toward St. Mildred's vicarage. The cobbled walkway glistened, and the flower beds, though overgrown, exhaled the sweet, earthy perfume of rainfall on early summer soil. Daniel walked in silence beside her, the folded letter from Lillian still tucked inside his coat pocket. His nervousness hadn't returned, not fully, but Miss Marple could sense the thrum of uncertainty beneath his outward composure. She knew that feeling well. Confronting the past was never easy, especially when the past was alive and breathing. And very much dressed in clerical black, Reverend Simmons answered the door himself, umbrella in hand and eyebrows raised. "Miss Marple," he said, and "This is Mr. Kirkwood," she said simply. He knew Lillian. "He's come a long way, and we were hoping you might spare a few minutes." The vicar hesitated. "I suppose I can. Please come in." The sitting room of the vicarage was small and warm, filled with mismatched chairs, tea rings on old coasters, and the faint scent of beeswax polish. Simmons motioned for them to sit, then folded his hands. "You've read the letter?" "Then," he said to Miss Marple. "We have," she replied, "and more besides." She turned to Daniel, who reached slowly into his coat and handed the envelope. Across the table, "This was written to me," he said. "Before she died, she trusted me, and she trusted you." Simmons took the letter with trembling hands. He read it once, then again. His face remained composed, but his eyes filled with regret. "She knew she was in danger," he murmured. "And I said nothing." "You did something," Miss Marple corrected gently. "You preserved what she gave you. But I believe you still haven't told us everything." There was a long pause. Reverend Simmons's voice dropped. "Lillian came to me not just to confess, but to name. She believed someone in the village helped cover up what happened to her years ago. She never said the name outright, but she described moments, meetings, whispers behind closed doors." Daniel leaned forward. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Simmons shook his head. "Because what she suspected would have implicated more than one person. People with standing, with reputations. I wanted to believe she was mistaken. That grief had turned her suspicious." "She wasn't wrong," Miss Marple said. "Giles Denham may have killed her, but someone else made it possible. Someone who allowed silence to flourish." The Reverend stared at the fireplace. "There's something you should see," he said at last. "Something I found in the vestry cupboard the morning after she died. I didn't connect it at first, but—" He rose and disappeared into the adjoining room. A moment later, he returned with a slim, cracked leather journal. He opened it, revealing faded ink and trembling handwriting. "It's the parish visitor's book," he said, "for the year 2011. Look here, this page." Miss Marple and Daniel leaned in. A name was scrawled in uneven letters. "L. Cope, here to meet E.B." Miss Marple blinked. "E.B. Edith Hornby?" The vicar nodded. She was a lay assistant then. Oversaw the altar guild, managed schedules. Lillian was listed as a visitor 2 days in a row. But no one remembers seeing her. Miss Marple sat back slowly. "I believe Edith lied about when she last saw Lillian." Daniel frowned. "Why would she do that?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Because she knew more than she ever admitted. Lillian used her return address once, years ago, and Edith may have intercepted more than a reply." Reverend Simmons stood silently. "She may have warned Giles, or destroyed letters, or worse. She may not have killed Lillian," Miss Marple said softly, "but she built the cage that Lillian never escaped from." As they left the vicarage, the clouds began to break, faint shafts of morning sun falling between the branches overhead. Daniel exhaled slowly. "She tried to tell the truth," he said, "again and again. And now," Miss Marple said, eyes focused on the road ahead, "it's time someone else did too." Chapter 14. The Altar Guild meeting. Miss Marple had always admired the way village institutions kept their secrets. Not deliberately, mind you, not with malice, but with a kind of quiet reverence for continuity like lace that covers a table too old to be seen plainly. Nowhere was this more evident than the Marleycombe Altar Guild, which met every other Wednesday in the vestry with folded hands, folded minutes, and folded truths. This Wednesday was no different. On the surface the 6 women of the guild had gathered as usual in their mid-season cardigans and sensible shoes. They sat around the long wooden table, hymnals in neat piles beside lukewarm tea, and a tin of biscuits. At the head of the table sat Edith Hornby. As always, she was in her pale mauve today, with a brooch in the shape of a lily and ironing Miss Marple noted without comment. Edith's face was as unreadable as ever, the skin tight about the cheekbones, her lips always just about to press into a line of disapproval. But Miss Marple had long known. It wasn't disapproval Edith feared, it was being discovered. "Ladies," Edith said crisply, glancing down at the printed agenda, "we have the matter of the chancel flowers to address. Mrs. Godfrey has donated white asters, though I told her lily would be more traditional for Ascension." Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. "Before we begin, Edith, might I ask the group's indulgence for a personal matter?" Edith blinked. The others murmured politely, "Of course, Jane." Miss Marple's eyes moved to each face, pausing last on Edith. "It concerns the late Miss Cope," she said quietly. "I know it's not pleasant, but I believe there's something yet to be understood. And I believe someone in this very room may hold a key." The room stilled. Edith's hand twitched near the agenda. "Jane, is this really appropriate?" "It's necessary," Miss Marple replied with a warmth that didn't yield, "because I believe Lillian came to this church, sat in this room, and asked for help." She turned to Mrs. Landon, who looked startled. "Do you recall her visits?" "In 2011? Mrs. Landon shook her head. "I wasn't yet in the guild," Miss Marple nodded. "But you were, Edith." All eyes turned. Edith's lips parted, then closed again. "She listed you in the visitor's book," Miss Marple said gently. "Twice." As he be Edith's voice, when it came, was thin. I don't recall. Many girls came through in those days. Did they all use false names?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Did they all ask to remain unannounced? Or was it only Lillian Cope?" The silence was heavy. Finally, Edith's mask cracked. "She shouldn't have come back," she said, not looking at anyone. "It was all so long ago. She stirred things we had all put to rest." Miss Marple kept her voice calm. "What things?" Edith's eyes glistened with something more complex than guilt, something tangled, old, and knotted tight with self-preservation. "She came to me back then," she said, "as a girl, with that letter. She didn't want it posted from home, so she used me. I told her I'd send it, but I didn't." Gasps flitted around the table like startled birds. "I thought I was protecting her," Edith said quickly. "And Giles, too. He was part of the council then. A good man. Important to the community. I thought she was trying to cause trouble. So you intercepted her words," Miss Marple said. "And she vanished, alone, discredited." Edith looked down. "I thought she'd forget, move on, but she came back. And when she did, I warned him," she whispered. "I told Giles she had returned. I thought maybe he'd speak with her, settle things." Miss Marple's voice dropped. "You gave him the time and space to stop her." "I never meant," Edith's voice cracked. "I didn't know he'd kill her." "But you feared he might," Miss Marple said gently. "And you stayed silent." No one spoke. At last, Miss Marple reached forward and folded the printed agenda, laying it flat. "This guild cares for the altar, for symbols of peace and truth. But truth, Edith, isn't something you store in a silver drawer. It's something you tend to, or it rots." Edith began to cry, small, Soundless tears that stained her collar. Mrs. Landon put a trembling hand on hers. Miss Marple rose, her shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders. She didn't need to say more. The altar guild would meet again, of course, but from now on, it would meet with a little more light in the room, and perhaps one less lily-shaped brooch on Edith's chest. 15. The letterbox is painted by the following week. A subtle but notable change came to Marleycombe. It didn't come in the form of grand announcements or sweeping public gestures. No town meeting was held. No newspaper articles were written. But still, it came in red paint. Miss Marple first saw it while returning from the post office. Basket in hand, her steps slowed by the weight of contemplation. She paused at the corner of Clematis Row, just beside the crumbling stone wall that bordered the old footpath. There it was, the letterbox. Only now, it had been scrubbed clean, its surface freshly painted in a vivid glossy red. Not the faded, chipped crimson it had been for decades. No, this was a new red, bold, fresh, unmistakable. She stood for a moment, her head tilted, observing. At its base, someone had placed a small bouquet of white forget-me-nots, tied with twine. No card. No signature. Just remembrance. Thought you might come, said a voice behind her. It was Daniel Kirkwood, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes on the same object. I didn't paint it, he added quickly. Someone did it last night, quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then someone somewhere felt it was time. Daniel nodded. The vicar's sermon this morning was about restoration. I suppose this fits. They stood side by side, two figures in quiet reflection. You've done something good here, Miss Marple said after a moment. I only answered her letter, he said softly. That's more than most do. He turned to her then. What happens now? She adjusted the handles of her basket. Now? Life continues. The police will close the file formally. Giles Denham's confession and the recovered letters will see to that. Edith Hornby will resign from her posts in due course. Quietly, of course. There may be no headlines, but consequences don't always need trumpets. He looked down at the bouquet. Do you think Lillian knew it would take all this? I think, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. She only hoped someone would. Finally, listen. That someone would care. Daniel was silent. She's buried now, he said, in the churchyard. I went this morning. It's quiet there. A blackbird was singing in the hawthorn tree. Miss Marple nodded. Good. She deserves peace. They lingered a few minutes longer before parting, Daniel heading back toward the vicarage path, and Miss Marple on toward home. As she passed the village green, she noted a handful of children playing. Their laughter was light again, unburdened. An old man read his paper beneath a chestnut tree. Mrs. Bantry walked her dog and waved, cheerfully. Marleycombe was settling, not forgetting but settling. That evening, at her writing desk, Miss Marple wrote a short note to Inspector Cray. Dear Inspector, the letterbox has been painted. No culprit identified, but I rather think it's best left that way. Yours, J.M. She sealed the envelope and placed it in her own letterbox. Then she returned to her knitting chair, lit the fire, and let the silence return. Lillian Cope's voice had been heard, and for the first time in a long time, Marleycombe was listening. Chapter 16. A visit from Margaret Denham. It was just after noon when Margaret Denham arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, unannounced and without warning. She stood at the threshold like a figure from another world, paler than before. Thinner, her blonde hair pinned up in a loose bun that seemed more practical than styled. She wore a long gray coat despite the warm day, and her eyes, once dulled by routine and quiet sorrow, now held something different. Not peace, not exactly clarity, but perhaps a readiness. Miss Marple opened the door without hesitation. Margaret, "May I come in?" "Of course, dear. I've just made tea." They sat in the sunlit parlor, where the china cups clinked gently and the scent of early roses drifted through the open window. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. She held her teacup between her hands as if to warm them, even though it wasn't cold. "I've been staying with my sister," she said finally, "in Tavistock. She's kind, if a little overbearing. She made me eat scrambled eggs 3 times a day for the first week." Miss Marple smiled gently. Scrambled eggs can be comforting, especially when the world turns inside out. Margaret gave a small laugh, dry but real. "I didn't come here for sympathy," she said. "I know what people are saying. That I knew what Giles was. That I allowed it. That I looked away." Miss Marple placed her teacup down gently. People often fill silence with suspicion, especially when grief makes them uncomfortable. "But they're not entirely wrong," Margaret said, staring into her lap. "I did know. Not everything. Not the details. But I knew he was cruel. That he had lied to me, perhaps for years. And I stayed." Miss Marple reached over and touched, her hand light as a breeze. "You stayed because it was safer than leaving. That's not weakness. That's survival." Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears. She didn't blink away. "She came to the house that night," she whispered. "Lillian. She stood in our sitting room, braver than I've ever been. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She just asked Giles to admit it, to look me in the eye and tell the truth." Miss Marple nodded silently. Margaret's voice trembled. "I told her to go, not because I hated her, but because I couldn't face what I already knew. And I was afraid of what he'd do, of what he might do to me." "She knew," Miss Marple said quietly. "She understood. That's why she framed the second letter. She didn't want vengeance. She wanted the truth to live somewhere, even if it was behind glass." Margaret sat very still. "I went to her grave," she said. "I said thank you. That's all I could manage. And I brought Lily." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I think she would have preferred something wilder. Maybe violets." "She always did like things that grew where they weren't supposed to," Margaret murmured. A pause. Then she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small bundle, wrapped in blue cloth. "I found this in Giles's desk. I thought it might matter." Miss Marple took it carefully and unwrapped it. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a young Lillian, perhaps 16, standing on a swing, smiling. And beside her, partially cut from the frame, a man's arm. Too old to be a schoolmate. Too familiar to be innocent. "Who took this?" "I don't know," Margaret whispered. "But I think Giles kept it all these years, as a reminder, or a warning, to himself. Or to her." Miss Marple placed it gently on the table. "I'll see that it's added to the inquest file," she said. "But more importantly, I'll make sure someone remembers her as she was. Whole, laughing, brave." Margaret looked up, eyes full. "Do you think people will forgive me?" Miss Marple gave the faintest shake of her head. "That's not the question, dear. The question is, can you forgive yourself?" Margaret closed her eyes, and in the quiet that followed, something unspoken seemed to pass between them, the kind of forgiveness that begins in silence and ends in peace. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked Margaret to the garden gate. They stood in the golden light for a moment before parting got as Margaret walked away slow, but straighter than she had arrived. Miss Marple turned and looked up at the sky. There were clouds, of course, but also light between them and beneath. That light, the truth was still growing. Chapter 17. The inquest was held in the Marleycombe Town Hall, a squat sandstone building with green shuttered windows and a flag that drooped even on windier days. Inside, the council chamber had been cleared for the coroner's table. with chairs lined up in uneven rows, and the air heavy with anticipation. It wasn't every day the village found itself host to a legal proceeding more serious than a property dispute or a dog without a license. But today, the air buzzed with something else. The need for closure. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her hat modest, her hands folded over a pale blue handbag. She did not take notes. She did not whisper to neighbors. She simply watched and listened. The coroner, a soft-spoken man with horn-rimmed glasses and a calm manner, began by summarizing the timeline. The discovery of the body. The arrest of Giles Denham, who had since confessed to pushing Lillian Cope down the garden steps, and whose death in custody a week later had left more questions than comfort. What followed was a careful unraveling of the facts. Testimony was given by the pathologist, who confirmed Lillian's injuries were consistent with a fall, but also with force. The constable who had been first on the scene described Denham's behavior, distant, defensive, then unraveling into incoherent rage. And then, the letters. They were read aloud, in part edited for length and sensitivity, but their content gripped the room like a sudden frost. Lillian's voice, steady and articulate in ink, painted a clear and painful portrait of a young girl coerced, dismissed, disbelieved, of a life shaped by betrayal and silence, of a return to face the man who took her truth and nearly her future. There were gasps, tears, but no interruptions. Next came Daniel Kirkwood, who sat stiff-backed as he spoke about their brief time together in Norwich and how Lillian had entrusted him with her last plea, that her voice be heard, even if her life was not spared. When he finished, the room was still. Then Reverend Simmons stood. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. Yet his voice, when it came, was strong. She came to confess, he said, not to absolve herself, but to find someone who would listen. She knew the danger. She came anyway, and I, like many others, did too little, too late. At last there was Margaret Denham. She walked slowly to the stand, her face pale but composed. I didn't know everything, she said, but I knew enough. Enough to fear, enough to stay quiet, and for that I will be sorry every day I have left. The coroner nodded, thanked her, and called for a short recess. In the courtyard outside, the village gathered in small, subdued clusters. There were no arguments, no outbursts, just the low murmur of realization of a story that had lived among them in shadows, now brought into light. Miss Marple stood beneath the old linden tree, her expression unreadable. She was joined by Inspector Cray, who offered a quiet nod. You were right, of course, he said. Not about everything, she replied, but enough. She was braver than most, Cray said, coming back, writing it down. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. She gave them the chance to do the right thing. And now some have. When the proceedings resumed, the coroner gave his verdict that the deceased, Lillian Cope, died as a result of unlawful force applied by one Giles Denham, who has since taken his own life while under investigation. Furthermore, this court recognizes the failure of certain individuals and institutions to protect Miss Cope when she first reported abuse as a minor, and again upon her return. Her death, while caused by a single man, was made possible by a system of silence. Let the record show this, so the silence ends here. There was no applause, only the sound of chairs quietly shifting and a long breath of grief let out at once. Evening, Marleycombe was still. Shops closed early. The pub was quiet. Windows glowed faintly behind curtains that were drawn just a little earlier than usual, but something had shifted. The letterbox had been painted. The truth had been spoken. And in her little parlor, Miss Marple allowed herself one rare indulgence. She poured a second cup of tea and sat simply satisfied, because for once Justice had not been loud or triumphant. It had been quiet. And true. Chapter 18. The blue envelope. Week after the inquest. Life in Marleycombe began to settle again, but not in the way it had before. The village was quieter now, not with repression, but reflection. The kind of silence that follows a storm, not hollow, but hallowed. And then, just when Miss Marple thought the final threads had been tied, something unexpected arrived. A letter. It came on a Monday morning, delivered by Mr. Timms, the village postman, who had regained a touch of his old good cheer after weeks of heavy-hearted deliveries. But this letter was different. It was marked with a foreign stamp, French, and addressed in a bold, unfamiliar script. To Miss Jane Marple, St. Mary Mead, Marleycombe, England. What caught her eye was the envelope, a pale blue, unlike anything else in her usual post. Miss Marple, curious but composed, took it inside and placed it on the tea tray. She sat in her usual chair, lit a small fire, despite the spring warmth, and opened it carefully with the silver letter knife her nephew Raymond had once given her. Inside was a single sheet of elegant cream paper. It read, "Dear Miss Marple, you do not know me, but I knew Lillian once. In another life, another country. She lived in a small flat above the florist shop I ran with my aunt in Marseille. She was kind, quiet, and very lonely at first, but she soon became a sister to me. She never told me much about her past, but one night, after too much wine, she mentioned a village, a girl, a lie. She said if anything ever happened to her, the truth would be safe with you. I found your name in her things after the papers reported her death. I waited until the inquest finished, thinking you might need time. Enclosed is a copy of the last letter she wrote. She never sent it. She said she didn't want it to be a wound, only a record. She spoke of you with the highest regard. I hope this letter reaches you in peace. Yours sincerely, Colette Marchand." Miss Marple sat very still. Carefully, she unfolded the second page. Enclosed behind the letter, a handwritten note in Lillian's unmistakable penmanship. The same slanted script, neat and clear. If this is ever read, then I did not make it back. But perhaps that's all right. Not because I've given up, but because I know someone like Miss Marple exists. I always believed the world needed more. Women like her, quiet, stubborn, and good. She reminded me of the truth when I had forgotten how to believe it mattered. I'm not leaving this to accuse. I'm leaving this to end it. Because secrets rot. And if someone has to dig them up and name them, then let it be me. To anyone reading this, don't let silence win. It doesn't save you. It only buries you slower. L.C. Miss Marple folded the page, her fingers trembling slightly, and placed it gently into her desk drawer alongside the original letter and photograph. She didn't cry, not out of coldness, but out of reverence. Some words were too full for tears. She looked to the window. Outside, the newly painted letterbox stood tall in the sun, red and proud. And Miss Marple, for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to lean back in her chair and smile, because Lillian's voice had not only survived, it had traveled, it had reached, and now it had rested in the right hands. End of Chapter 18. Next. Chapter 19. Mrs. Bantry has a theory. Would you like Chapter 19 now? Chapter 19. Mrs. Bantry has a theory. It was a bright, clear morning when Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, hat askew, cheeks flushed with excitement, and a bundle of crumpled newspaper clippings in her gloved hand. Miss Marple, trimming her roses, barely had time to look up before her friend called out from the garden gate, "Jane, I've had a realization. A revelation, in fact. And I need tea immediately." Miss Marple, used to Dolly's entrances, opened the gate with a smile. "I thought it might be one of those mornings." Inside, over strong Assam and buttered toast. Dolly spread the clippings on the table like a hand of cards. "I've been reading everything again," she said breathlessly. "And I think we've all been asking the wrong question." "Oh?" said Miss Marple, stirring her tea. Dolly leaned in. "Everyone wants to know why Giles Denham killed Lillian. But I think we need to ask, why then? Why not when she first returned? Why not years earlier when she wrote the first letter?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "You're quite right, Dolly. Timing is always telling." Dolly tapped the table excitedly. "Exactly. I think something changed. Something made him desperate, made him panic." She held up a clipping, a small notice from the Marleycombe Gazette, dated 3 weeks before Lillian's death. "Parish Council to review historical complaints archive amid new transparency measures." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes," she murmured. "I recall. Part of that new oversight committee Margaret Denham had just been appointed to head it." Dolly nodded fervently. Lillian would have known, and Giles certainly would have. What if her return wasn't just personal? What if she knew her old report, the one the council buried, was about to come to light? He could have kept her silent 10 years ago, but this time the file was out of his hands. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she stood, walked slowly to her writing desk, and retrieved the original letter from Lillian, the one recovered from the drawer, posthumously addressed to the parish council. She read a line aloud. "I am no longer afraid of what people will think if they finally know the truth, especially now that truth may soon come to light with or without me." Dolly's voice dropped. She knew, and Giles must have realized that even if he silenced her again, the paper trail was already moving. Miss Marple nodded. So he did what cornered men always do. He chose violence. Too late to stop the truth, but just in time to destroy the one who dared speak it. Dolly blinked. Isn't it awful? To realize that sometimes the spark for justice is also the match that burns someone alive. Miss Marple returned to her seat. But justice didn't burn, Dolly. It endured. Because Lillian made sure it couldn't be buried this time. Dolly sniffed. "Still, I'm rather glad Edith Hornby stepped back from all her committees. That woman always had the moral compass of a weathervane." Miss Marple chuckled. "Will you tell the inspector?" Dolly asked. "I already have," she replied. He found the archival breach. Lillian's original report was signed and dated, just as she said. It had been misplaced for years, and the new transparency order required it to be reviewed by Margaret Denham herself. Dolly whistled softly. Well, that would explain why he snapped. If Margaret saw that file. She didn't. Lillian never let it get that far, but she was going to, and that was enough. They both sat quietly for a while, the weight of revelation settling like mist on the rim of the TEACUPS dot. Then Dolly sighed. "You know, Jane, for a small village, Marleycombes had more murder and secrets than any London street I've ever walked." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That's because in London, people hide behind walls. In villages, they hide behind smiles." Dolly raised her teacup to the women who smile and still see everything. Miss Marple touched her own cup to Dolly's, to the ones who don't let silence win. Chapter 20. The garden seat. It was a quiet afternoon when Miss Marple returned to the bench beneath the apple tree at the far end of her garden dot. It was not remarkable. This seat, an old thing, faded by decades of sun and softened by moss at the edges, but it had always been her favorite. From there, she could see the village rooftops in the distance, the spire of St. Mildred's, and the red flash of the newly painted letterbox peeking through the hedgerows. She had sat here when Raymond was small, reading Treasure Island aloud while he leaned against her skirts. She had sat here through sorrow, through long summers and brief winters, and once many years ago, through a similar case of betrayal that had never made the papers, but lived in her memory all the same. Today, though, she was waiting, not for a visitor. But for a moment. The garden was nearly still, except for the occasional flutter of wings or the whisper of wind through the lavender. And in that hush, Miss Marple allowed herself to reflect. So many lives had turned in recent weeks. Lillian Cope had finally spoken. In her way through letters, through those she left behind, through the painful, hard-won truth she dared to unearth. Giles Denham, the man who once held power over her, had been undone not by violence or vengeance, but by a woman's refusal to be silent anymore. And Margaret Denham, in her quiet dignity, had faced what many never could, the collapse of everything she had believed in, and the courage to keep standing. Even Edith Hornby, though far from forgiven, had stepped down from her committees and issued a written statement to the parish, the closest thing to an apology the village might receive. That, too, was something. Miss Marple reached into her knitting basket and drew out a folded piece of paper. It was Lillian's second letter, the one she had sent to the council and never expected to be read. On the back of it, in the margin, was a small note, barely a whisper. In ink, tell the truth, even if no one listens. The act itself is enough. A single sentence, not a declaration, not a plea, just a truth. Marple refolded the letter and tucked it away. Then she leaned back, feeling the warmth of the bench beneath her, and let her mind drift, not toward another mystery or another wrongdoing, but toward peace, because that, in the end, was the gift Lillian had left behind. Not just the truth, but the possibility of peace. A sparrow landed near her feet, blinking in the sunlight. Somewhere down the lane, a child laughed. A wind chime tinkled faintly from a neighbor's porch. And as Miss Marple sat there, breathing it all in, she smiled, because the world was still full of shadows. But as long as there were people willing to see, to ask, to listen, there would always be a light to meet them, even if it came quietly from a garden seat beneath an apple tree.